Hey friends! LFOs are one of the distinctive features of the Octatrack and can be applied to nearly any parameter of a sample's playback. I realized I haven't really done this topic justice, so I wanted to dedicate a little more time to it and explore one simple yet extremely versatile application of LFOs. LFOs for start slices. Here's the basic overview. Take a sample and split it into 16 slices. Apply an LFO to the start point and set it to trig sync trig. This resets the LFO each time the pattern repeats and ensures that we can repeat our results. Since the LFO is bipolar, meaning its wave moves above and below the default value, set the default slice point to the midpoint of the depth. In our case, with 16 slices, we'll set the start point to slice 9. As you adjust the speed, the LFO will select different slices to trigger along your sequence. From here, you can audition different sequences, or even assign the LFO speed to your crossfader for a more performative approach. I actually made a video about this technique 3 years ago, but this time I want to delve a little deeper, particularly on the sample selection side. Once we can identify the role of a sample in a pattern, there are ways to refine sample selection and manipulation to improve the odds of landing on something we want to keep. With each new technique, it's important to leave some room for our creativity to adjust, and let it shape other aspects of our process. Speaking of which, making these videos gives me the opportunity to slow down and explain my own process. Thanks again for watching, commenting, and encouraging me to continue. If you haven't yet, please remember to like and subscribe to this channel. And if you'd like to support me even further, you can subscribe to my Patreon newsletter, which is linked in the description below. Okay, let's look at some examples. For our first example, we have a rhythm loop. Typically, I like to set up some kind of existing beat, so that our sample can take on a more supplementary role. Here we have a kick, a tambourine loop, and a simple snare hi-hat combo. The sample I'm choosing to work with is intentionally simple, a series of claps with some reversed reverb. After splitting the sample into 16 slices, I notice that they are each an eighth note in length. Some of these slices start silent, with the clap halfway in. This is important to note because if I want to hear those slices, I'm going to want to space out my trigs long enough for those claps to sound. In other words, I'll try to design the sequence in eighth note increments. By default, the pattern is set to 16th notes, so I'll be mindful to spread them out a little bit, leaving at least one trig in between. We could also adjust the scale down to eighth notes, but this isn't a hard and fast rule, and I want to leave some room for happy accidents. Now let's apply the technique. We have a saw LFO set up to modify the start point of the sample. The depth is set to the number of slices we have, and the default start point is at the midpoint. For a 16 slice sample, that's slice number 9. If we place a trig on 1, the sample plays from the first slice, confirming that our LFO is modifying the default slice parameter to play the first slice. You don't have to set it up this way yourself, but I like to do it this way because it gives me an easy way to return to the original unmodified sample. From here, we can start to play around. Remember, it doesn't take a lot to get something new. With just a handful of trigs, I can hear how the loop moves around the existing beat, adjusting the speed of the LFO to get different variations. If I like how the pattern is sounding, I can leave the speed alone and add or subtract trigs from the sequence to make smaller changes. This approach can be a bit disorienting because the traditional methods of sequencing are no longer available. If I want to trigger a specific slice, I have to p-lock the LFO to 0, which can get complicated fast. But if I'm willing to relinquish that kind of control, I can let the sequence lead itself, and all I have to do is decide what gets to stay. If I do my homework, pre-select the right kinds of samples, and come up with some rules about how they're sequenced, I can play with more confidence, knowing that the possibilities will end up sounding pretty good. Next, let's look at how this technique can be applied to notes. So this is the idea that actually inspired me to revisit this whole topic. When we use LFOs to determine which slice is going to be played, we can also think of this as a chance-based process in which each of the slices is a possible outcome. So why don't we try making some samples made of slices that represent outcomes we want? I'm going to start by designing an ARP from notes that I think would work well in a bass line. I'll probably lean on the root of the key, in this case A, as well as some fifths and sevenths, but overall I'm mostly going off my gut. Remember, it's okay to repeat notes. Essentially, this just improves the odds of them being selected in the LFO process. I'm not too worried about tone at this point, and I'm leaving the high end open because I'm going to filter it out later in the Octa track. We're going to make sure the tempos are synced up, set the ARP to 8th notes, and record a 2-bar sample. Once we slice it up, we're now ready to apply the same LFO technique, and we can play with some different ideas. This part is super subjective, of course. I'm going to borrow the concept we used in the rhythm section, letting the sample play past the length of its slice, and keep the length and hold values pretty high. Then I'm going to adjust the filter to give myself some nice envelope movement on the trigs. Notice how the filter envelope acts on each of the trigs, but stays low on the note changes that occur later in each slice. Notice also how you can adjust amp envelope settings to hide or show different parts of this bass line. I find it really satisfying that once we're working with the right kind of sample and establish the rules of play, nearly every option is a viable one. To add some variation, I'm going to throw a second slow-moving LFO on the filter width. On top of that, I'm going to try out a little bonus technique. Using the LFO designer, I've created something similar to a square wave, except instead of being bipolar, this one goes from the neutral value to maximum. What this means is that when the LFO is at its first value, the parameter is unaffected, but on the second value it will be maxed out. When I apply this to pitch, I can get the bass line to jump up an octave. Be sure to set this LFO mode to hold to keep the pitch from jumping in the middle of sample playback. Okay, now that we have a bass line, let's use this same technique to add something melodic on top. Since our bass line is so active, we want to be pretty sparse with sequencing, nothing more than a little bit of ornamentation. So for this track, I'm going to set the playback length to 1 and reduce the amp envelope to get a pluckier sound. For our ARP, I'm going to draw on some music theory here and choose notes from the Lydian mode, but I'm also throwing in extra instances of the notes I want to hear more. This time, I'm keeping the playback length short so that each trig plays a single note. Once we set up our LFO, we can once again focus on rhythm in the sequencer while the LFO chooses the notes. As before, if you don't like the choices, you can simply adjust the LFO speed. Additionally, since the LFO is set to restart with the pattern, if you want to preserve an early portion of the melody, simply p-lock the speed after that point, and the LFO will only modify the trigs from then on. At this point, we've covered pretty much everything I want to talk about. I like this method because it forces me to think a little bit sideways about sequencing, while also inviting a little more intention on the sample preparation side of things. It's easy to get in the habit of throwing all kinds of samples into the Octa track and experimenting with them there. But once we start to identify consistent personal goals, we can reduce some of the time it takes to get to those goals. This method sacrifices some of the more detailed sample playback in exchange for a fast, audition-based sequencing technique that itself will require some practice. But I personally think it makes the Octa track feel a little more like an instrument and less like a computer. Best of all, the ideas are easy to preserve once I arrive at something I like, allowing me to utilize all the other features available on the Octa track if I so choose. I plan to explore and develop this technique further in future videos. Until then, thanks again for checking out this video, and good luck creating.